Okay, so we have a rough idea here of what the supply curve is going to look like. So we understand what is quantity supplied, analogous to quantity demanded. And now let's try to figure out what is behind the law of supply. So the law of supply, as we saw in the previous example, says the following. As the price increases, quantity supplied increases. That's the law of supply. It says that the supply curve is upward sloping. Quantity and price. Here is our supply curve. So the supply curve is like the same thing we did with demand. It's just the entire relationship between price and quantity supplied. So the supply curve is the entire relationship. Between price and quantity supplied. Okay, so what I'd like to do is to try and understand what is it that causes the supply curve to be upward sloping. So, as we talked about before, how much are you willing to sell your smartphone for? So, willingness to accept is the key part of supply, right? At a particular price, is the seller willing to accept that price in exchange for the good they're going to sell you? All right, so now, what underlies that? What determines my willingness to accept? I'm going to argue it is my marginal cost. Typically, this is going to be of production, right? So I'm going to make, let's say I'm making a smartphone. What is my marginal cost of making an additional smartphone? I'm going to argue that that's the price I'm going to be willing to accept, or the lowest price. So why do I make that argument, right? What determines my willingness to accept? Well, let's go back to chapter 3. We talked about optimization. Optimization says I want my marginal benefit to be at least as big as my marginal cost. So if the marginal benefit of doing one more of something is bigger than the extra cost of doing one more of that thing, it's beneficial for me to do that. So think of it from a seller's perspective. I'm going to sell you one more smartphone. What is the benefit to me as the seller is whatever money you're going to give me. That is the price. So when I'm selling, the marginal benefit is the price P. That's the extra benefit I get from selling you one more smartphone. Then I'm going to compare that to how costly it is for me to make one more smartphone. As long as the price is at least as big as the additional cost of making the smartphone, I'm more than willing to accept your payment for my smartphone. So what happens if the market is perfectly competitive is that the price is simply going to be equal to the marginal cost, meaning price and marginal cost are going to be the same thing from the seller's perspective here. So marginal benefit equal to marginal cost means that the lowest price I'd take from you for an additional good is the marginal cost. So lowest price willing to accept is the marginal cost of making one more. That's sort of the definition of the marginal cost. So I want you to get used to thinking of the supply curve is just representing also the marginal cost curve for the firm. Now, if you took microeconomics or if you're going to be taking microeconomics, you'll go into that in much more detail. So you'll think much harder about costs and all of this kind of stuff. And we're just kind of glazing over the surface. But I think our basic idea of optimization makes that clear, right? I want my marginal benefit greater than or equal to the marginal cost. The benefit of accepting your payment in exchange for my good is the price. The marginal cost is whatever it is. How much does it cost me to make one additional unit of this good, right? So think of it in terms of, exchanging the cell phone. If I offer you $150 for your cell phone, that's the benefit of selling it. The cost is whatever it's going to cost you to then replace the cell phone. And so depending on what type of new cell phone you want, you're more or less willing to accept my exchange. Okay, so that's the basics there of supply. So I want you to get used to thinking of supply, marginal cost. That's what determines my willingness to accept a good, is the marginal cost of production. Supply is marginal cost. So if I drew my supply curve here, Q and P, if that's supply, it's exactly the same as marginal cost, right? The price has to be equal to the marginal cost. And so that is where the law of supply is coming from, is that the more of something you want me to produce, right? So if I think of making 5 cell phones for you versus 10, my marginal cost is going to be higher, right? The more of something I make, the more expensive it's going to be to make more. So think back to my oil example, right? So when I'm extracting oil from Saudi Arabia, it's right there underneath the surface, marginal cost is relatively low. I can be willing to accept a lower price in exchange for selling you a barrel of oil. The more oil we have, and the more I need to extract or produce, the higher the marginal cost because I'm using the resource more, right? The more I use the resource, the more expensive it gets to continue to get more out of it. So that is what underlies the law of supply. Marginal cost is increasing the more of something I want to produce. And you can think back to our oil example to make sense of that, right? Saudi Arabia, cheap. Arctic Circle, expensive. I need a higher price to go to the Arctic Circle than Saudi Arabia. Okay, so that is the supply curve, the law of supply, a little bit of some of the details of where it comes from, but I'll kind of shove off the more deep analysis to your principles of micro classes if you take one in the future. Okay, so next we'll talk about market supply, and then we'll be off and running with our supply curves.